Welcome back to Cheddar Reveals, brought to you by CuriosityStream. One of the great Alaskan political struggles has been the balance between preserving nature and drilling for oil. Consider this one a swing in the direction of nature. President Biden had been under pressure from environmental groups to fulfill a campaign pledge to ban new permits for oil and gas drilling on federal land and offshore. On Monday, the Interior Department said it plans to block oil and gas leasing on about 11 million acres on Alaska's North Slope, reversing a controversial Trump administration effort to expand that area. Now, Biden's administration also suspended oil leasing in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, a largely untouched 19 million acres on the opposite side of Alaska's Arctic in the northeast corner of the state, often called America's last wilderness. And one of the main protectors of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is the Alaska Wilderness League. Joining us now is the Alaska Wilderness League's acting executive director, Kristen Miller. Kristen, thank you so much for joining us. What kind of work does your organization do, and why is it so important, especially right now?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. The Alaska Wilderness League is a DC-based national organization, and we have staff in Alaska and across the country who work full-time to safeguard Alaska's wild landscapes. So we work to secure federal policies in Congress and through the administration that protect these unparalleled places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Tongass National Forest, and our nation's largest piece of public land in the Western Arctic, the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska. The state of Alaska is home to a third of the federal land in the United States. So these are lands with irreplaceable ecological value. They are the traditional homelands to hundreds of indigenous communities who have lived and relied upon them for thousands of years. They are a critical resource in addressing our climate crisis, and every American has a voice in making sure that they are protected.
Yeah, you mentioned being the homelands of indigenous peoples, irreplaceable ecological value. Can you explain what exactly is being threatened by drilling here? You also mentioned even our future when it comes to climate change.
Absolutely. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is at threat for oil and gas development, is our nation's largest and wildest refuge in Northeast Alaska. It has been targeted by Alaska's politicians and oil drilling proponents for oil development for decades. As the world is facing a mounting climate crisis, these proponents are clinging on to economic and energy policies of the past. To this day, they remain determined to see oil and gas development move forward in this fragile landscape. So in 2017, a controversial provision was slipped into the massive Republican tax bill that mandated an oil and gas program for the Arctic Refuge. So this law required that 2 lease sales had to be held by the year 2024 on the coastal plain of the refuge. This meant that after a half a century of this world-renowned wildlife area being protected, for the very first time, it was open for oil and gas development. At the time this law was being passed, this Arctic Refuge oil program was sold to the American public as a way to lower the deficit, and there were promises of billions of dollars in revenue. But when the lease sale was finally pushed through, this happened in the final days of the last presidency, the first lease sale on the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge actually generated just around $12 million, which was less than 1% of the revenue that was projected. This is because oil drilling in the Arctic Refuge simply doesn't make sense from a business perspective. This area is remote, it's expensive. The Gwich'in and Inupiat people, indigenous people, have lived there for thousands of years, and they rely on this area for their way of life. And then you add in a mounting climate crisis, and it is just clear that the coastal plain is an expensive risk. It's not worth taking, and that's what the oil industry showed us with that lease sale.
Yeah, Kristen, I want to switch gears with you and talk about Alaskan wildlife. Earlier on in the show, we were talking about the polar bear migration from Alaska to Russia. Can you detail the status of polar bear migration and also what your organization is doing to protect polar bears?
You know, the story of the polar bear is just another piece of why this piece of land, and a single piece of land, can be so important to a species and to the climate crisis. We know that polar bears are one of the species suffering the most from the drastic effects of climate change. What we are doing as a public lands organization is working to make sure that their habitat and their home is protected. So in Alaska, that means fighting back the threat of oil and gas development in the Arctic Refuge. The coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is the most important land denning habitat for Alaska's southern Beaufort Sea polar bear population. This
Right.
population is one of
Kristen,
the most.
oh, I'm so sorry to cut you off. We're just coming up against the end of the show, but Kristen Miller, Acting Executive Director of the Alaska Wilderness League, thank you so much for joining us and highlighting those really important issues.